I'm Margaret Barrett Hein.
And I'm Bobby Barrett Crisp. And Margaret is 2 years older than me, so we are sisters.
I was the sixth child born to John and Florence Barrett, and I was born up in Winchester, Virginia. And when I was about 6 weeks old, my father had taken a job at the People's Drug Store in Fredericksburg, which was then located on Caroline Street. And our first home was what we called ROWE's, Rose Place, and it was out at 5 Mile Fork. Now, see, 1942, the war was on. Things were rationed. You had your ration stamps. And I remember my father, it was a 5-mile walk, ride, or whatever, to come to the People's Drug Store. He either rode his bike or rode a horse because the gas was being rationed. And we only lived there a short time. We moved to what is Woodlawn now, the Woodlawn subdivision over off of Deacon Road. And that place was called Harder's Place. Mr. Harder worked at the Avisco plant in Fredericksburg. And we had a big farm. My father was good about giving us every kind of animal you can imagine. Goats, turkeys, ducks, guineas, banty roosters, okay? And each one of us had a chore. You know, one boy took care of the pigs, one took care of the cows, somebody took care of the goats. There were 9 of us, so, you know, he could spread us around. Well, the interesting thing about my father moving here and thinking, well, he didn't know anybody in Fredericksburg, was the first prescription that he filled at the People's Drug Store was written by one of his best friends and college friends from Pittsburgh, and that was Dr. Lloyd Bush. And so, you know, they renewed their friendship. And Dr. Bush, I guess I would say, went on to deliver my 5 younger sisters and even Bobby's oldest girl. I mean, I'm thinking maybe 3 generations of children. And when I would go see him in the office, you would see patients in there with like a peck of apples or a bag of potatoes, and they would come in there. That's what they actually paid him with. And sometimes he would say, no, I don't want you to have to pay me, because he knew his, I guess, patients that well. Let me see. Oh, the other thing, the Lloyd Bush Stadium at Stafford High School was named in memory of him. He ended up raising his 4 grandchildren. His oldest son had passed away, so he had a son and grandchildren going to Stafford, and he would give the athletes free physicals, and he would sit on the sidelines during the games in case any of the, you know, students were injured. And that's why I believe they honored him with that. Well, so when we lived at Harder's, that's where Woodlawn Subdivision is, the closest grocery store was Earl's. And at that time, it was just a little, I want to say almost no bigger than this is what it seemed like to me. And because, here again, I guess by then Mother had 7 children, she would make a list, and she would send my older brother and sister with the little red wagon up to Earl's. And Earl's would help them pick out what they wanted, you know. And then Daddy, on his way home from work, would stop in and pay for them, because my mother didn't drive. But I know my father just had the best things to say about Earl. That, you know, as an independent grocer, he went on to have one of the biggest grocery stores in Stafford County. Now it's Earl's Hardware. His son runs the Earl's Hardware. But his children worked in the store, too, with him. All right, now, I was in the first class at Montfort Academy. We were Catholic. And my father, growing up in Pittsburgh, you know, I want to say it was almost predominantly Catholic. So he thought it was very important to get a Catholic school here. And so I went to Montfort for 2 years. And in 1950, we all went into the public schools. So after we left Harder's, we moved down on Route 3 towards the beaches, is the way we called it, to Snowden Farm. Actually, Bobby's side of the road is called North Snowden Farm, and across the road is Snowden Farm. And that has a lot of history, too. But, you know, we were told that during the Civil War, the boats would come up the Rappahannock. and that evidently there was either a civil war or they thought a civil war general was there or whatever. Anyway, they blew off the house at Snowden. And then as a child, I can also remember the steamboat would come up the river, and there was a bend in the river, so whenever it would get in that bend, I guess he wanted to let other boats know they were coming. They'd blow their horn right there. So, that was a noise I like to hear. All right, digressing, I mentioned that I was in the first class at Montfort Academy, and we lived 7 miles from the Chatham Bridge. And my father didn't, he worked full-time pharmacist, 12-hour days, and my mother didn't drive. So he went to see Mr. T. Benton Gill, who was the superintendent of schools. And he said, I don't have transportation for my kids to the Catholic schools. And Mr. Gill was kind enough to say, well, Mr. Barrett, you're paying taxes, not sending your kids to the schools. He said, the least I can do is offer you transportation. So he allowed us to ride the bus as far as the Chatham Bridge, and we'd get off the bridge and walk to Montfort. And we only did that 2 years. And in 1950, we all went into the public schools. And the first public school that I went to is Little Falls School, which is down on Route 3. And I started in 3rd grade. It was, I like the history that other people talk about their schools, but our school was it had 2 big rooms. In one room, you were taught 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade by Mrs. Jones, who later on became Mrs. Ballard. And then 4th, 5th, and 6th, you had Mrs. Ely. And I mean, I just loved that school. And it was like we were family, that each class was small. I believe maybe in the 6th grade there were 10 of us, but in the 5th grade there were only 4 students. And the advantage that I think that we had there was we usually had a brother or sister in the room with us. So if one of us misbehaved, we got told on when we got home. So Ms. Ely didn't have very many discipline problems. And the other thing that I remember about that school was, she would, let's say, teach the 4th grade, then she'd have to go over to the 5th grade, then she'd go over to the 6th grade, and she would usually give us busy work. She'd say, okay, do this math, and then she'd go someplace else. But sometimes, let's say, she was teaching 6th grade, and she'd ask the students a question. If they couldn't answer it, she could ask a 5th or a 4th grader, and they could answer it, because, see, we were listening to her teaching the other subjects. And I think quite a few of the students that went to Little Falls went on to be valedictorians at the high school. I mean, it was a very good education. And one of the other people that I'd like to remember is Annie Minker, is what we called her. I don't know if her name was Ann E. or A-N-N-I-E. But she was an elderly lady, and she drove a station wagon. And because we didn't have a lot of library books, she would bring us boxes of books, just transfer them from one school to the next school to the next school. And when I was in 6th grade, every week we had to give a book report. And my kids would complain about having to give one every 6 weeks. But every week. So this is a funny thing on Miss Ely. By the time I was in 6th grade, I told Miss Ely, I said, Miss Ely, I've read every book in this room. I can't read another book. There's no more books. Maybe I can get Daddy to bring me a book. So she goes over and she pulls out an encyclopedia. She hands it to me. And she says, all right, Margaret, read this. So I open it up. I start reading. And all of a sudden I realize, go back to her. I said, Miss Ely, I can't give a book report on this book. It's got too many characters. And she just laughed. But yeah, we had a great time at that school. And here again, 2 outhouses. We had to go out to the outhouse, and we were usually greeted by snakes and spiders, and so we didn't want to go out there very often.